Quotes here from the ladies.
Good morning, folks. We're here for another edition of the Old School Shooters podcast. My name is Jack Kilby, Executive Vice President of Great North Wrestling. And we have a very special guest today, a man who is a wrestling luminary, a broadcaster, and a historian of women's wrestling, here to talk about some of the issues surrounding the mythology around the Fabulous Moolah, Mr. Nigel Sherrod. How are you today, sir?
Thank you guys for both of you for having me. It's really a pleasure. Doing well, and I hope both of you all are doing well today.
Thank you. The second man in this three-man booth is a man that really needs no introduction. A larger than life individual, looking absolutely resplendent as usual, and that would be one King of Connecticut. King, how are you this morning, sir?
I am doing tremendous. And, I'm really excited to have this guest on, Jack. And I saw a clip this week from Dutch Mantel, and he was maligning the fabulous one, the legendary Fabulous Moolah. And I live in Florida now, but I lived in the Columbia, South Carolina area. I had a place out by Lake Murray for 14 years. And I love that community, that area, and got to know all the folks. Matter of fact, Jack, we recently had Richland County Sheriff, Richland County encompassing Columbia, South Carolina, Brady Nimmons on the show here on Old School Shooters. And he was talking primarily about his time in WCW before he got into law enforcement and became Richland County Sheriff. But Brady and all of the people that I met in and out of the professional wrestling world in the Columbia area had such great reverence for Lillian Ellison, for the Fabulous Moolah. Got to meet some of her family members as well. And it's really sad to me to see her maligned by people like Dutch Mantel. While I lived in Richland County, South Carolina, I was a head trainer for Campo MMA, and I would train some of my MMA fighters that lived on that side in that area in the ring of a woman named Susan Green, who professional wrestling fans would know as Susan Tex Green. And she was a protege of the Fabulous Moolah. And she had a ring in her barn that was like an old pride ring. It's like a big boxing style ring. And she was such a great lady, and in getting to know her and in training some fighters out there in her ring, I got to hear some great stories about Moolah, and she had such great respect for her mentor, the Fabulous Moolah. So on that note, I want to turn things over to Mr. Sherrod, to Nigel, to talk about the Fabulous Moolah.
Thank you, Kingfish. I will. I mean, where do we start really with the Fabulous Moolah? I can start from the beginning of her upbringing. We can just dive right into the controversy, what has happened recently. It's up to you guys, but I'm happy to do either one.
Why don't you start just by giving some of the younger fans just a little bit of a perspective on who Moolah was, and then bleed right into the controversy.
Perfect. Be glad to do that. Bear with me because I like to put things within context. A lot of shows, a lot of people don't like to do that. However, I think it's a necessity when you're talking about history to contextualize things. So basically, Moolah, grew up in Kershaw County. She was the youngest of 13 siblings. All of them were boys. Her mother passed away when she was 8, for reasons of her. I don't, as you can imagine, I'm sorry, I think my feed cut out. What I was saying is, as you can imagine, a father trying to help his young daughter, and only one daughter within a group of 14 kids, he looked at going to wrestling as something that she might enjoy. When she did go to wrestling, she happened to see world champion Mildred Burke, who at that particular time was managed by promoter Billy Wolf. And we can hop into Billy a little bit later, but just for reference, at this particular time, the men ran all women's professional wrestling. We're talking about, in the 30s and going into the 40s. So Mildred was working for Billy Wolf at that particular time, but she was so enthralled by women's wrestling, Moolah was, that she decided that she was going to get involved. And in fact, she did. At first as a manager, Slave Girl Moolah with the Elephant Boy and Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, and then later on she would go on to become, obviously, in my opinion, the greatest women's world champion of all time. She started a school with her first husband. She continued that on with Buddy Lee, who was her second husband, from my understanding. And they trained ladies originally not at the place, not at the big mansion and what everybody thinks of her final home, I guess I would say, to make it easier. But they actually had a house, and it's still standing, because I went by there a couple times, when I've been in Columbia. The house is still standing. They would train the ladies. Sweet Georgia Brown, first African-American female wrestler from the state of not California, South Carolina, was trained by the Fabulous Moolah. And they did that training actually on 1 or 2 mattresses within the house. Women's wrestling at that particular time was very niche, if you will, or niche. So, kind of hold it here. Okay, it was dominated by the males. So Moolah, I guess, decided in her career moving up that she wanted to take, control of that. She got with Buddy Lee, and they ran Girl Wrestling Enterprises. Now, prior to this, Mildred Burke had tried to, after getting beat up and having over 50% of her money taken away from Billy Wolf, the male promoter, as well as being cheated on by Billy Wolf because they were married at the time. She had enough of it, and I'm giving you a nutshell story here. There's a lot more to it, but essentially she had enough of it, left. Women were not allowed in the NWA boardroom at that particular time. She had to have an attorney go with her. They came to an agreement, but unfortunately the NWA and Billy Wolf kind of, I don't want to say outsmarted, because that's not really the right phrase, but they outmaneuvered Mildred. And to be fair, because of the leverage at that time, they were able to do that. When Moolah came along, he went on to manage the Dixie Chicks, Buddy Lee Attractions in Nashville. It still was standing a couple of years ago. I don't know if it still is now, but essentially in the early 60s, whenever they split, Moolah as a woman took over controlling basically, the main women's wrestling scene at that particular time. There were other groups like June Byers, Mildred Burke in California was running a school as well with Mae Young. But nobody really had the success of Lillian Ellison. So
yeah, now I want to interject there for us some of that aspect, Nigel, because one of my old friends, well, actually 2 of my old friends, coaches, and mentors knew Moolah, Frankie Kane, the great Mephisto, and Billy Wicks, who was like a second father to me. And they both knew Billy Wolf. And they said, without mincing words, that if you wanted to be a wrestler before Billy Wolf, you had to screw Billy Wolf. And he screwed, in another way, his own wife out of the business. And you're right about it's always been such a male-dominated business. Billy Wolf was also very abusive, as you alluded to, not just with Mildred Burke, but with his other wrestlers. And if you look at the history of professional wrestling, it's always been so male-dominated. Look at Ann Gunkel, and what she tried to do. It's always been dominated by the males. And I think, Nigel, what a lot of folks don't understand is that Moolah was more of an advocate for these ladies. She was like a den mother, if you will.
That you're 100% right on that. And let me just briefly pause. Let's also not forget that women were just allowed to vote a couple of years before Moolah was even born. So let's put that into perspective too. The way women were being treated back then and accepted. It was accepted. In fact, there's a story in Mildred Burke's book, autobiography. I don't know if it's an autobiography, but it's a biography. Feeds cut out for a second, but it's Mildred Burke's book has a lot more details. And to be honest with you, they're so graphic that I really don't want to dive too deep into them. But he literally punched her in the face, beat her up, took everything she had. And that's a great point too, King, is that, whenever Billy Wolf was running things, he took 50%, at least 50% of what the ladies were making. And going back to what you said, if you wanted to work for Billy Wolf, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's how Moolah kind of decided to go another direction. I believe the quote was, I could get to the top of the business without having to screw that old fart or something like that. And so basically, yeah, she said, I'm going to go my own way. And she did. Jack Pfeffer was a big friend of hers. And then later on in her career, she got linked with Vince Sr. And so that's kind of all that relationship kind of developed there. Yeah.
Yeah. And, talk about the living arrangement, because that's something that's come out with this controversy. She housed these girls, these young ladies, and talk about that, and talk about the controversy and some of the smears and lies that have been out there.
Or maybe I cut out for a brief second. Let's dive into that though. The ladies that were at Camp Moolah, we'll just call it Camp Moolah for the purposes of our discussion to keep it short on that. But the ladies at Camp Moolah did not have to live there. They didn't have to live there. That is that's a false. It's floating out there. Some 14-year-old who probably couldn't tell you who June Byers was wrote that, and now it's seen as fact. But in fact, in speaking with Tony Rose last night, she's a prime example, and there are many other ladies who did not live on the property. However, if you did live on the property, there were houses, and I've gone back, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but you'll just have to take my word for it. And if not, I can always go back and research again. But at that particular time, the rent that she was charging these ladies was not even half the rent that most of the places in Columbia were. They had water, air conditioning, big pond, workout facility. You could be right there at the gym. But if you didn't want to be there, that's cool too. You didn't have to. So But she did have a compound, and on that compound there were several little cottages. Those were rented out to the ladies. Oftentimes, and this is not brought up a lot of times, unfortunately, people kind of forget that they borrowed money, but she would loan the ladies money out whenever they needed it, and she would say, "We'll put it on the books." I don't know past that if there was any interest added or whatever, but nonetheless, it's pretty cool for a you're working for them, so you can, of course, get your money back in the long run. But she provided a place. She would cook dinners. She would have parties. Everybody was allowed up at the big house. Sure, not everybody was the biggest fan, but who is the biggest fan of their boss? A lot of times, you're not going to have 100 percentile on that. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. So it was a very open place, but guys were not allowed. Drugs were not allowed. Later on, alcohol was definitely not allowed. They had to sneak alcohol in because I've talked to some of the ladies, or a lot of the ladies, and this will give you guys a smile, and maybe for anybody listening, but Moolah would always say, "I know you're up there taking those marijuana pills." And I always kind of joke that, you know what? Not only was she a visionary in pro wrestling, but she was a visionary in THC, because now there are marijuana pills. But
she and promoter Tony Candello from Winnipeg are famous for saying marijuana pills. So yes, dual credit there of about the same vintage.
That's right. That's right. They both deserve their own strain of marijuana pills. Although I'm sure they'd both be horrified at the idea of it. But nonetheless, so that's why when all this talk about men and drugs and all this other kind of stuff come up, it takes about 2 seconds of logic to really go, that didn't happen.
Where did this all stem from, Nigel?
Well, I'll tell you what I know. And then maybe as a discussion, you've heard things, and Jack, maybe you have too, where it started from. And I have pictures from the 90s and the 80s of Penny Banner and Moolah together. And they're, like best buddies. So it's odd to me that if Penny had such feelings about Lillian, that she was taking pictures and hanging out with her and having dinner and all this kind of stuff. So Penny Banner is one of the ladies that said something. That said, and this goes back to kind of what we were talking about before we got on the air. But men can do certain things, but women can't do certain things, and so therefore, it's just kind of viewed differently, and there's different rules for ladies than there are men. I hate to say it, but I feel like they're judged on a different level,
especially of that era, for sure. From what I've heard from a lot of the work that you've done, Moolah was regarded as a tough but fair and equitable boss, and some of her former students, including Susan, indicated, this is a tough business, and you wouldn't be doing the women any favors by
screen froze up. Okay, here you go. I'm sorry, my screen froze up again, and I do apologize. I've got all bars going here, but
no, that happens. I was just saying that from the research that you've undertaken, interviewing some of her former students, the consensus seems to be that Moolah was a tough but fair boss, and that Susan Tex Green made a comment that you wouldn't be doing the recruits, if you will, or the students, any favors by being soft. So I believe that's a fair approach to training, especially given the time frame we're talking about.
Yes, and before I kind of froze up my screen, the point I was making about Penny Banner, I'll go back to that briefly. I'm sorry. There's so much information that I want to get out to people, and I'm trying to condense everything. But Penny also wrote in her book that her husband, Johnny Weaver, beat her. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. Now, when anybody mentions Johnny Weaver, does anybody throw a fit? Nobody does. So why do we take what Penny said about Moolah in her book for fact? We only take that part for fact. We don't take the part about Johnny Weaver. There's still tournaments for Johnny Weaver. There's still people that, and look, I'm not here to attack Johnny Weaver. That's between him, good Lord above, or whatever your beliefs are, and Mrs. Banner. They're both gone. They can't speak for themselves. So I don't really want to go too far into that, because then I would be a hypocrite, talking about the dead. But I'm just saying, you asked the question, that's where it came from. Another place that it came from was some of the family, Sweet Georgia Brown. And I don't know if we can cue this up, but I do have a video when we get into the allegations and everything that happened later this week of some quotes from some of the women, but also Michael McCoy, who was the son of Sweet Georgia Brown. Now, what happened there is there's multiple brothers and sisters. The sister had one opinion about excuse me. And in fact, in the video that I have a clip of, sorry, coffee's getting me this morning. Michael says that it wasn't Moolah who squandered the money. It was in fact his family that did it. His aunts. He says auntie, but you get what I'm saying. It's the same thing. And so he said that his family spent all the money that was sent home. And just kind of threw them to the side. All of his relatives had nice things, but he and his siblings did not. That has nothing to do with Moolah. That's his family. So Sweet Georgia Brown and Penny Banner are the two big ones. I really don't like to give much any airtime, to be quite frank with you, with Mad Maxine, who was in the business for less than 2 years. She was over 6 foot tall. She was already a professional athlete, from what I understand, or had done some volleyball. And she got into the business, and she was a journalist. That was her whole thing. She was a journalist and kind of wanted an expose on the business. That doesn't get said a lot because, well, it's the truth. So it would kind of interfere with everybody's wrong narrative. But
it looks like Nigel froze up there, but what I wanted to say was, I think that Moolah was largely a victim of timing, because there was this movement, and it was just 3 words: believe the woman. And it was a rather irrational movement that no matter what woman claims, you had to just believe the woman. And Moolah got caught up right in the middle of that. That's since been, obviously it's so illogical. That movement has since been pretty much squashed. And even the Me Too movement, now people say, let's just take a step back here and let's be sane. But there was an insanity about this believe the woman movement. And I think that the sad thing is that corporations like WWE, they have no stones, and it's sad because they're pioneers and they're legends in this ridiculous cancel culture. And I've said on this show before, you can't be canceled. We have free speech in this country. You can't really be canceled. But these corporations, they just buckle. They don't look at the facts. And I think that Moolah was a victim of that.
Well, if I could jump in there for a second, Nigel, that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you, but I'll just advance it on the agenda. When in recent years, prior to the WWE Fabulous Moolah Memorial Battle Royal that was going to take place at WrestleMania, she was regarded, at least in their television product, still as a beloved figure, given her appearances in the Attitude Era with Mae Young and several cameos. I think of the famous one with Mean Gene and Mae Young at WrestleMania. But then it seemed within the span of 72 hours, they decided that they were going to take Moolah out of the name of that battle royal. And from what I understand, listening to an interview you did with Moolah's daughter, that was largely due to the Snickers Corporation and WWE buckling to that within record time. Can you shed some light on that whole series of events?
Sure. And I wish that I had the name of the website. I'll have to send it, and then maybe we can link it for a little hate mail later for these folks. But essentially, it was just kind of one of those online deals where somebody felt like they needed to prove a point. So they wrote Snickers, and essentially they started a petition and got 10,000 people to sign the petition. Now, 10,000 is a big number when you think about it, of people, but not really when you think of a small portion of the wrestling audience. People would rather hear a salacious story and believe it than to believe the truth. And so therefore, I kind of was fighting a battle. But I'll tell you both, gentlemen, I called Snickers every single day for probably a year. They never had anything. And I asked them for evidence all the time. They never had anything. And I would update them with every interview that I did. And it got to be so many interviews, I realized they weren't going to do anything. I've not eaten a Snickers since 2017, and I used to eat 2 a week. So they've lost money on that front. But I just think it's one of those things where the fans kind of put them in a position. They're a company, Snickers, and both the WWE. And so they did what companies do. And especially, what you were saying earlier in that particular Me Too movement, there was no, we're going to listen to facts. It's just, we better cancel this right now. So going back to the cancel culture, she just got caught up completely in that. And before I could even get the truth out, because I remember seeing it when it was happening and people were like, she's an evil woman. But I thought, there's no way that anybody's ever going to believe this. And then like that, before I could do anything, it was out there. So Joyce Grable was the first lady that I interviewed, good friend. And then her answer kind of, and again, the pimping stuff was just not accurate. Yeah. So, but funny that you bring up Moolah being in the WWE. We were kind of talking about this the other day and how history has been changed at the WWE. Not to disparage the great Mae Young, because she truly was great. And she was one of the first pioneers, and she had to deal with Billy Wolf. In fact, I think she left Billy Wolf for the same reason Moolah never went to work for Billy for a long period of time, because she wasn't going to have relations with him. That being said, she was one of the women, in the 40s and so on, and that difficult time, that establishing time with Killam Gillum and people like that, and Elvira Snodgrass, so on and so forth. And so she was kind of in that period. So she's definitely a pioneer. Don't get me wrong. But there's so many times in her career throughout the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. For a long time, she wasn't wrestling. She might have popped up and done a match once here, once there. But the fact of the matter is she might have had, a grand total of 20 or 25 years in the business out of 90 years or however old she was when she passed away. So to me, it's kind of interesting. Not only that, but if you just dig just a little bit, you'd have to dig a lot further to find the stuff about Moolah. But if you dig just a tiny little bit, you would find that actually Mae Young was known. This happened at least once. I've heard it happen more than once, but it's documented at least once, that she would get in the car with guys. They would think that something was going to happen. She would beat them up, rob them. And in fact, I believe she got off on a court case, if I'm not mistaken, for leaving a guy out in the middle of the desert to die.
Yeah, it's funny, Nigel, because she was an old carny, May. I two of my closest friends and mentors and coaches I mentioned before with Pops, with Billy Wicks and Great Mephisto, Frankie Kane. Those guys came out of the Carnies too. And, you know, when I was hanging with Frankie down here in Florida 15 years ago, you know, he owned a strip club. He was doing mud wrestling. These are fun guys, man, but they're not choir boys. And, you know, they were telling me how Mae Young used to beat the hell out of guys and used to rob guys, and that's not outside of the wheelhouse. Let's not. This isn't romper room. You know, professional wrestling is a tough, rugged business. If you go back and you read the Rough and Tumble book that I did with Eric Paulson on the history of submission wrestling and the history of professional wrestling. I mean, now all these guys are, you know, playing with their joysticks that are wrestling now. Go back to the rooms and play with their joysticks. But this is a rough, rugged business if you study it historically. And Moolah, ironically, is the one who looked out for and protected the girls when Billy Wolf was screwing them and beating the hell out of them. So that's the disgusting thing here. And to see someone like Dutch Mantel make these comments. I mean, I'd love to have Dutch Mantel come on here if he's got the stones and talk to Jack and I, because I guarantee you it's not going to be like that squirrely little British guy. You know, we're going to come back at him with facts.
Yeah, 100%. And, you know, I just find it, and I don't, going back, I'm not trying to bury Mae Young, but I'm just trying to point out that, and to your point, the business was a lot different.
Yeah.
It was totally different. And so if we're going to point fingers at somebody else, then let's look at everybody else. In fact, if we're going to watch WWE and judge Moolah, you better not watch WWE. In fact, don't ever go to wrestling ever, because I guarantee you I have stories about everybody's heroes that you would not want to hear. And I'm sure both of you gentlemen have the same thing. You know, those parking lots in Memphis, it's funny how some of those bookers from Memphis forget that some of their best friends were with 12-year-old girls, but they'd rather spend time.
Yeah, we lost Nigel again, but to fill the gap, yeah, man. I mean, and I don't judge really people at all. I more judge the people who judge people, because the people that are throwing stones, those are usually the biggest scumbags.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's almost like in life, I have found that to be the case as well. Usually when people are throwing stones the hardest, it's because they want to keep you away from their skeletons that they have in the closet. But I'll digress on the Mae Young point. I wanted to bring that up because I find it highly peculiar that they get behind her, although her record is arguably worse and her contributions are arguably not even on the same level as Lillian, although
no, not at all. You said it, Nigel, because beyond the fact that Mae Young had all these long periods of time when she wasn't in the business, all these long sabbaticals, aside from that, Moolah was women's wrestling. And I think people also need to understand that it wasn't the bookers for the wrestling organizations that booked the women. Women were an attraction, and they called Moolah to book the women for various promotions, right?
That's right. And it was like the I'm going to say this word, but and I feel like safe saying it here, but midget wrestling. I know that, you know, it's kind of controversial to say.
You don't have to be. You're on the old school shooters. You don't have to parse your language or be PC on here.
Well, I work for companies, so I just want to protect my own self. And I don't want anybody to think that I'm talking negatively about them, because I'm certainly not. But I've worked with several midget wrestlers. And in fact, one of my good friends, Diamond Lil, who was a good friend of Lillian's and was basically her adopted daughter, she refers to herself as the damn midget still.
So that's how they were built. So that's a historical fact.
And you know, Jack, that's a great point. That's how they were built. But also, to Nigel's point earlier, the reason why there was midget wrestling stopped was largely reported to be because of the issues with the guys who were, and I don't want to name names, but the guys who were molesting young boys in professional wrestling. And that's been said that's why the midgets left. So that there's a lot of seediness in professional wrestling that's far beyond the stuff with Fabulous Moolah. And like I say, the irony, Moolah's the one who was booking the women, who was housing them inexpensively, making sure they ate right, making sure they didn't do drugs. And now she's the scapegoat in such a seedy business. So it's very ironic.
Yeah, it really is. And the certain attraction troops kind of, Andre even had his own booker, and the midgets had their own book. The giants had their bookers, the midgets had their bookers, the women had their bookers. I would love to talk to you more off the radio about the midget wrestlers and all that. I really didn't realize that was a facet, but there's so many different interesting facets. You can't know it all, right? But I would love to talk to you more about that. But going back to the women, so I'll revert a little bit and say, whenever Moolah took over back in 1964-ish, that was whenever she caught her husband Billy Lee with Rita Cortez, and so that ended that. So, side note, but if she kicked Buddy Lee out of the house for having an affair with another woman wrestler, do you think she was pimping out other women wrestlers to her husband? Anyway, I digress on that particular point. But once she wrestled it away, we were talking about percentages before, 50%. Moolah took that and cut it to 20 to 25%, depending on who you ask. Now, this is America. If you sign a contract and you agree to a contract, then that's on you. And this is another thing that doesn't really make its rounds, but in talking with legendary female wrestler Beverly Shade, who's still with us, Professional Wrestling Hall of Famer, total badass. She didn't wrestle at Moolah schools, at her school. They trained ladies at her and her husband had a little school. She would go work for Lillian Moolah, but she didn't live there. They trained girls. As I was saying earlier, Mildred Burke was training ladies. June Byers was training ladies. The difference between all those ladies and Moolah was that Moolah understood that it was a man's business. So if you want to, survive in that man's business, you have to play by those the man's rules. And so actually, in terms of whenever she came in, she protected the women. That's what drives me nuts, is that her whole thing was, I'm taking control of this women's wrestling, and I'm going to protect these girls so that they don't have to sleep with the promoter. Because guess what? Some of these women that, have said things about the money, which that's neither here nor there. We're talking about a different subject altogether today. But Moolah got the money first. So guess what? Sleeping with the promoter to get your money didn't happen because they didn't have the money to give them. It was already sent. And Moolah writes a check, gives it to the girls. She takes her cut, so on and so forth. So, again, a ridiculous insinuation that that's what happened. In fact, the exact opposite. At Moolah's, no drugs, no alcohol, as I was saying earlier. Didn't even have men on there. In fact, we'll have to maybe reach out to Larry Zbyszko. I don't want to.
We just had Larry on Old School Shooters recently. Yeah, Larry lives here in Florida. He's a good friend.
Yeah, if you have him on again, or even if you don't have him on again, just ask him about the story whenever he showed up with his brand new car and parked it kind of in the garage area at Moolah's. She didn't want the men there at all because, if they get pregnant, what good does that do her as far as a percentage, which is another, little common sense. But she slammed that garage door on the hood of Larry Zbyszko's car because she was like, get the hell out of here, So just famous stories like that, and just stuff that when you really start looking at everything, it just doesn't make sense. If you're here to say that Moolah was robbing all the girls blind, how can she rob the girls blind if they're not working, or if they're on drugs, or if they're drunk? It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and you know, she was a very smart businesswoman, and she was in Colombia for so many years, and she was so, like I say, so highly regarded there. And it's really, it's ironic and it's sad that the complete opposite has been reported about her. And on that note, Nigel, do you see the WWE potentially because they, well, I mean, let's use an example, right? They took Hulk Hogan came back. His was a different situation, but again, you know, do you see the possibility of them getting enough pressure on getting when the facts are reported to them that I mean, she's gone now, but that maybe they'll address this?
Well, I wish they would, but I have several clips on my own personal YouTube page, and this isn't a cheap plug for that. But if anybody wants to go see those interviews, they're there. I think that the interview I did with Judy Martin, when she broke down and cried and asked Vince and company to fix the issue, and then and we'll get into this a little bit more, obviously, later, but the implications from taking her name off of the Battle Royal and then the reasons that they kind of alluded to really did a number on the ladies.
Nigel froze up again, but Nigel, I want to ask you, is she still in the WWE Hall of Fame?
What's that? I'm sorry.
You froze up. We couldn't hear you, but is she still is Moolah still in the WWE Hall of Fame?
Yes, she's still in the Hall of Fame. But what I was going to say is I provided them with so much information. I directly emailed Stephanie, Triple H, several other different people within the office. I called WWE the same as I did Snickers. And they're just not going to budge. And here's why. They made their decision. Moolah can't make them any more money. That's WWE's thing. She can't make us any more money, so why are we going to stand by her? Loyalty out the door. She's dead. We're not going to stand up for her. I don't think they'll ever come back and put her over again in the capacity they did before. I don't think they'll kick her out of the Hall of Fame, though. If they haven't done it yet, I don't see that happening.
Nigel, you spoke about professional jealousy as, you know, at least part of the reason in some facet that this negative mythology developed around Moolah. What, if any, along those lines, do you see the role of, here in later years, especially, she was subject to a lot of criticism for holding the women's world title for a very extended period of time and then dropping it briefly to Wendy Richter and then getting it back again, and the vibe around that she had a monopoly on the title. Is there any, do you think, lingering effect of that, or is that largely forgotten?
Well, here's the problem with that argument is that's also false. That was a WWE marketing campaign that she was the champion for 28 years. In fact, it's on record, and women like Susan Green, who are still with us, actually defeated Moolah and held the belt for quite a while. And I think Moolah got it back at Madison Square Garden. Susan was telling me the story a couple months ago about all that, but nonetheless, yeah, she dropped the title several times. So this whole Moolah never dropped the title, no. That's some mark not doing research and going, oh, this is what the WWE said, so I guess it's got to be true. No.
Yeah, not very similar to WrestleMania 3, where Andre the Giant was dubbed to be undefeated, and also saying that Andre had never been body slammed. You know, Harley Race had body slammed Andre, Hogan had body slammed him previously. So that's all just marketing. That she held the belt for that extended period of time. But you brought up a name, Wendy Richter, and if I'm not mistaken, isn't Wendy Richter been quite hostile towards Moolah in interviews?
She has, and in fact, she said, and this is not me talking. I'm just, trying to rephrase her quote or just say it exactly how it was, verbatim. But she said, "I hope the bitch is rotting in hell."
Oh, that's awful.
You know what? Once somebody says that about somebody that's dead, I have your validity goes out the window as far as I'm concerned. The only reason that Wendy ever had a career, and I would say this to her face, I wish I could, was because of the Fabulous Moolah. Who put her in that spot? Moolah. Who had the connection to the WWE or WWF? Moolah. And yes, maybe there was a little bit of, she was, I don't even know because I wasn't there, but maybe just to give Wendy a little bit of breathing room for her sake of argument, maybe there was a little bit of, I don't want to drop the belt. But you know what? When you run an all women's wrestling school and there's a 20-something-year-old and you've been doing this for a long time and this is your business, and we're talking about the early 80s, I can totally understand. And you know what? Moolah was 100% right, because Wendy then went to Vince McMahon and asked for the same kind of.
Yeah, with Nigel, with you freezing up again, I just want to say, look at the disparity there of careers. Fabulous Moolah, such a lengthy career, and you talk about a flash in the pan. I mean, God, Wendy Richter, you're talking about 15 minutes there with Cyndi Lauper jumping around, and then she went into obscurity.
Big time.
Well,
she would. I'm sorry, Jack.
I was just going to say, it speaks to her mindset that she, as a professional wrestler, was upset over a finish and chose to make less money working for Vern at that time after leaving WWF and never really reaching the paydays that she would have had she continued in WWF. Sorry.
We need to talk about this, Nigel, because the infamous Spider Lady match, right, where Moolah or Richter rather claims that she didn't know that was Fabulous Moolah under the mask and that Moolah pinned her. What? Talk about that.
If you go back and watch Dark Side of the Arena, I forget who said it. Maybe it's Princess Victoria. But you'll have to go back and just watch it. It's on Hulu or wherever you can find your streaming stuff. But somebody said Wendy must have been the only woman or only person in that arena that didn't know that
didn't know it was Moolah. Exactly.
That's right. And here's my thing about that.
Nigel freezing up again, but for the younger fans, if you hadn't seen it,
my screen keeps going out. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I was just saying, Nigel, for the younger fans that haven't seen that, you go back and watch it, and God, even if you'd seen a couple Fabulous Moolah matches, it's so easy to tell. And there's Wendy Richter saying she didn't know who was under the mask. Give me a break.
Yeah, and I mean, here's the thing too: is Wendy likes to talk about how brutal Moolah was in the ring and how she was hard to work with. Well, wouldn't you, when you lock up, like, because I have several of Moolah's robes and personal effects and things like that, I can still smell her, 15 years after the fact, after she's been gone. Yeah. So if for Wendy not to know that, again, that kind of goes back to, are you lying? Or are you trying to protect kayfabe, or are you really that dense? I think it might have been a little bit of your lying, and maybe you could be that dense. There's no way and again, Wendy goes on record saying how many times she wrestled Moolah and all this kind of stuff. When you lock up with someone, you know somebody that well, there's no way, even if they are wearing a mask, that you don't know who it is. Are you kidding me? That's the most ridiculous shit that I've ever heard. Hang on.
Well, Nigel, Wendy Richter was unaware that Dusty Rhodes was the Midnight Rider. Did you know that?
You might notice these boots. This is she won her last title in these with the WWE, but she also wore that whenever she dropped the belt to Wendy Richter. Those are right behind me. I know you can't see most of my stuff. But yes, isn't that funny? She didn't know who the Midnight Rider was either. So yeah, it's a bit of ridiculousness as far as that goes, and it's really unfair to blame Moolah, because that was a Vince McMahon decision to do the screw job. Moolah just worked there, and far be it from Moolah to say no, because Vince McMahon Sr. basically helped make her career, legitimize her career. They were behind her 100%. And Moolah, like I said, wrestled away control from the men, but Vince Sr. was an ally and an advocate, as time went on. And so she had absolute loyalty to that family. She had pictures of Vince Sr., Jr., and the whole family. I don't know if either one of you got to visit her house before or not, but very close, very close. So yeah, when your boss asks you to do something and you have a trouble employee, I don't see how that's the other employee's fault. I think if we want to blame somebody, let's blame Vince McMahon. But even then, I don't think he was in the wrong.
No,
So
let's. Oh, I'm sorry, Jack. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, moving forward, I noticed that you had a petition online yourself to right the wrongs with Moolah in terms of, having her restored to the prominence that she should be in the WWF, in terms of the opening. She was in the footage before. Nobody talks about her, et cetera, et cetera. Is there any esteem on that, or desire to sort of start a grassroots movement now that we're a few years, hopefully, removed from this cancel culture, et cetera, and the facts, I think, as you've laid them out in your work, speak for themselves, and it's worthy of Titan Sports revisiting it?
I would love for them to. I cannot give you all the details, but this is kind of how I feel about Wendy and a couple of these other old timers spewing basically garbage. Is I'm going to be around a lot longer than those people, and God willing, knock on wood. But the truth will eventually get out there. I've been working on a book. I just have a notepad that I've been, putting all this stuff together, but also there's a documentary coming out this month that I participated in on Pluto, and you can catch all the episodes of Women of Wrestling on Pluto as well. That's going to be available on streaming if you can't catch them on CBS syndication. But there's a documentary that comes out. So as time goes on, even if WWE doesn't right the wrong, it is a life work of mine. I will not stop because I'm a very loyal person. Somebody asked me this week, and we'll get to that somebody here in a few minutes, why is this so personal for you? Why do you care so much about the Fabulous Moolah? My question to those people is, why is it such a big deal to you to harass, bully a dead woman and these women that work for her? Look in the mirror, and I think you'll find the person with the bigger problem. But that's, again, my take on it.
So Nigel, I wanted to ask you just to step back and just let the fans know how you met Moolah initially, and a little bit about your relationship with her before her passing.
Sure. Yeah, because it's not, I get it. And people, I understand the previous question. People are like, why are you so, but when I was first starting out in the wrestling business, I was also working at a radio station as an intern when I was 16 years old. I was also working for the school newspaper, which at that particular time, our school newspaper quarterly would go out to the local newspaper. So everybody got a copy of it that, so I was doing series of interviews based on wrestling. So that's initially how we kind of got linked up. I can't remember even if I tried who I got the number from or whatever, but I knew that she lived like 3 hours from me. Anyway, long story short, we become really good friends. I visited her. She even gave me Vince McMahon's personal secretary's phone number. And she passed away in '04, but through those connections, sorry, she passed away in '07. But through those connections in '05 ish, I was able to get a tryout with the WWE, and I became the youngest announcer in, as far as I know, WWE history, at least developmental. I don't know of anybody younger at 17, and if they are, kudos to them. But that was a big step up for Moolah. Really helped me achieve that. And she was just, I want to make this one thing clear too. I'm a 16-year-old kid breaking into the business. She could have easily taken every dime that I had, and I would have given it to her, because when you're green, you don't know any better. You're just trying. Never asked me for one penny. And in fact, those boots that I just showed you were left specifically for me. Anything that I asked her for, I'll take it even one step further. She was, like you said, from Columbia, South Carolina, and reminded me a lot of my grandmother, who passed away a few years before I met Lillian. So I'm an old soul, and I respect the veterans, and I respect women. My mother raised me. My dad was nowhere to be found in terms of being at the house on a daily basis. So I have the ultimate respect. And that's not a knock to my dad. We've, mended the fence or whatever, but I just have the ultimate respect for women who bust their ass in a male dominated world to achieve this kind of stuff. And so therefore that respect is really what solidified. And then also she reminded me so much of my grandmother, but I'm so glad that I had that, because now at my job with Women of Wrestling, I'm one of the few men that work there because of that Moolah instilled into me. And anybody watching this, you can say, BS. I look at no matter how attractive one guy might find any of those girls, those are my sisters. We're in a business together.
I think Nigel's freezing up again, Jack.
I said I would never do anything inappropriate or make any kind of comment like that, because of what Moolah instilled in me and taught me and made it an issue of that. And I mean, I'm not a bad guy anyway. I wouldn't do that morally anyway, but I'm just saying Moolah hammered that in big time. And that's why because I'm a loyal person, and I know both of you gentlemen are towards your folks, you understand that. But some people don't understand loyalty, because there's just not a lot of loyal people out there.
Oh, it's so true, Nigel. It's so true. And, it's so sad that that a legend really, there's no one on the male side in professional wrestling, and there's no one really in different types of professional sports that is as iconic as the Fabulous Moolah was in women's wrestling. And that's why I wanted to have you on. And it's really been a pleasure. But I know Jack has a question that he always asks everybody. And we've taken folks down the road here, and we've educated folks on old school women's wrestling. And Jack, I think you know the question I'm referencing.
Yes, sir. Well, as the name of the podcast implies, we're interested in retrospects and philosophy around what it means to be old school to you, and not just in terms of the business, but old school as in a philosophy and a lifestyle in the modern era, in these trying times, some of which we've discussed today.
Sorry, guys. Okay. Old school as far as a philosophy and a lifestyle. That's what I heard from you, Jack.
What that means to you, yes.
What it means to me. Well, number one, we've talked about how crooked the wrestling business can be. But to me, old school is number one, doing what we're doing here today. And that's respecting those who came before us. There's nothing more old school than that. Respect That's the main thing for me. Somebody had to come along and pave the road. Without those people, we would not have the road that we drive on. It would be that rocky road that they traveled on, and most of us would not make it on that road, just to be quite frank. Maybe we could, but I'm just saying in general, it's not an easy business. Old school to me is respect, is loyalty, is doing the right thing. Whenever you leave a territory, whenever you leave a place, leave it better than what you found it. It's just, there's so many different facets, but those are some home.
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, great points, Nigel. And I know we're getting towards the top of the hour, and I want to just say I wish I could perform this song for the Fabulous Moolah, the late Fabulous Moolah, but I think she's looking down and she can hear the verse of the song that's typifies old school shooters, a song originally crooned by the chairman of the board. I've been to town, beyond the boulevard, down the beach, and I've learned things that only time can teach. Silver sages spreading knowledge to the younger ages. Thank you to our guest, Nigel Sherrod. Thank you to my co-host, Jack Kilby. Another episode of Old School Shooters. Have a great day.